We have an extra speaker. I think we're very fortunate that we've got Professor Kathryn Maitland here. She is the PI on the feast study, which if you haven't read about, you must. She is a professor from both the Imperial College in London, but she works in East Africa and is based in Kenya and in Nairobi now and been there for many, many years. She has extensive experience in working in the environment which I believe many of you are going to work in or do work in. And so I'm very glad that Kath has been able to come. Thanks, Kath.
Thank you very much. I've been added to the agenda because I talked yesterday to the group that the focus group that was looking at shock and shock guidelines. So these are slides largely adapted from yesterday's talk. So I just wanted to present some of the information about the feast trial that I always get lots and lots of questions on. So I've got very few minutes to do this, but I think one of the first things that one should always remember when you're a doctor, this is what we signed up to when we qualified as doctors. And for a decade, I was in Kilifi giving fluid boluses to children thinking I was saving lives. But I'd never done a controlled trial at that point in time. So for me, the feast trial result was as surprising as for the rest of you. We were not expecting that result. We had to do the trial because doctors in Africa were nervous about rolling out recommendations that largely come from the north and without testing their safety in the conditions in which the feast trial was conducted. So who was in the feast trial? We spent a long time with Professor Levine and many other people really thinking about who do we want to target. And we wanted to help clinicians who were in the emergency rooms or in African hospitals, just the critically ill, undifferentiated patient. We did exclude large subgroups, those who come in with trauma, burns, and gastroenteritis, importantly, and also severe malnutrition. But for those, and they were very easy to distinguish as they came in, but largely this is undifferentiated shock, in other words, malaria, sepsis, etc. And this is the type of place in which, this is Sorote Hospital, one of the hospitals that were involved in the trial. This is the patient that's in the feast trial, and probably another 3 or 4 patients will join this child within the hour on this very bed. So it's a busy district hospital, and this is why we had to do the trial. Quick reminder of the trial. It was a controlled trial testing two different solutions, albumin versus saline, and then obviously control no bolus, just given maintenance. Most of the boluses are given in over the first couple of hours, and they're the definitions of the shock that we used. I'll talk a little bit about that later because there's still been a lot of questions of that. And this was the main result. The fact that actually fluid boluses increased mortality. A lot of that mortality was very early on after we'd resuscitated them, but 48-hour mortality was significantly different in both the albumin and saline group. We got a pre-specified analysis plan, and one of the things that the statistician, who is extremely experienced for the trial, said, I have never seen such remarkable consistency in my 30 years of clinical trial, being a clinical trial statistician. This means this result is true, and I think the important thing is that it was true across every single age group, all 6 centres that were involved, and every single subgroup that we'd pre-specified, malaria, sepsis, and many of the other groups. Often people have misinterpreted it, saying, well, all the kids were anemic and no wonder fluid boluses were harmful. So this is a sub-analysis that was done in a later paper at BMC Medicine. I'm going to refer to that later. You probably can't see it, but we took every level of hemoglobin. The top one starts off at 3 and the bottom one comes down to 11. So if fluid boluses were any beneficial, you would have seen that in the higher ones, but if it was going to be anemia that affected. But you see, for every single diamond, this is called a forest plot, it doesn't matter what level of hemoglobin, fluid boluses were harmful. We looked at all different signs of shock, whether there was a particular sign of shock that we could look at, but also dehydration. Although these gastroenteritis was excluded, even severe dehydration, decreased skin turgor or sunken eyes, that was quite common in these children. Even that group, fluid boluses were harmful, and those with moderate hypertension. The entire, as I say, Babika said, the consistency was remarkable. People said, well, you didn't really include children with sepsis in the trial. Yes, we did. 12% of the children had bacterial sepsis. And as you see from this, which is not published, but right at the bottom, mortality in the bolus arms were 14% compared to no bolus of 8%. What about those who had impaired renal function? Should we be giving them a fluid challenge? Well, this data suggests you shouldn't be, because even those with a high blood urea nitrogen, you see 25% mortality with fluid bolus compared to only 12% who didn't. So once again, consistency across those. So in response to this, MSF assembled all their heads of the groups. In preparation, they commissioned this systematic review, which said the best quality of evidence. There is only one controlled trial, and that is FEAST, and the best quality of evidence have been generated by that. And fluid boluses should be not recommended for the settings in which FEAST was done. So that was commissioned specifically by MSF. 2 years following the FEAST trial, the WHO presented their latest guidelines, which continue to recommend fluid boluses. And this is the guideline, which recommends very, very relatively aggressive fluid boluses, giving up to 60 mils per kilo. Most children in the FEAST trial only had 20 mils per kilo, and we showed harm with that, but up to 60 mils per kilo as fast as possible. There's been a lot said about, well, the definitions of shock in FEAST. We spent a long time designing this and thinking about it. And the FEAST trial, whilst none of the shock definitions worldwide have ever been tested against physiological data, we actually covered the spectrum of all of the international recommended guidelines, right from the FEAST all the way through to the WHO. And for every single one of those, I think that's obviously very, very dense, and people can go away because this will be available and have a look at the numbers. It doesn't matter what definition of shock you used. Fluid boluses were harmful. The more stringent the criteria, in other words, the ones that are picked out, the really severely ill, the biggest difference was between the boluses and fluid boluses. This just says the same thing. Effectively, they're all statistically significant. So even with the WHO definitions, they've found a 28% increased risk of mortality. So we published this paper so to make people aware the fact that actually WHO hadn't changed their guidelines, continue to recommend fluid boluses, and also calculated the number of excess deaths for all shock definitions, just saying that if you continue to give fluid boluses, if the slippage occurred, then these are the excess deaths that would be imagined in Africa each year, and this is a very conservative estimate. A lot of people are saying, well, the group who had real strict WHO shock, they're a small group, therefore we should still be able to apply the guidelines. This is the statistician, Babika, I told you about, and he said he agreed, yes, that this was a small group, but that actually that this is exactly what we found, that the effect size was consistent with across the whole range of shock definitions, and therefore imprecision is irrelevant in this group. So, i.e. the continuing recommendation suggests that a lot of children will be harmed. How common is WHO shock? So I have assembled, and this is a rubbish slide, the tables are not great, but effectively, if you actually go and look at the cohorts that have presented data on the WHO definition, it is an infinitesimally small number of children. The only reason why we only had 68 children out of 3,000 admissions and 100,000 children that had been screened was because it wasn't there. It is a very, very small group, and by continuing to recommend fluid boluses for that tiny little group, if you still don't believe that the p-value, then slippage will occur, and this is exactly what was found in a cohort across Kenya. But again, series of cohorts that we've looked for the WHO shock, it really isn't there. And even very severe hypertension that we had in the Feast B arm, once again, very, very small numbers. Only 32 had extremely severe hypotension. So it's a group that doesn't exist. So why are we continuing to recommend fluid boluses? All of this I've talked to you is available in the extra publications. They're all freely available and open access. One of the reasons why we've all believed that fluid boluses are better, this is shock reversal at 1 hour. And so this is what doctors see. You have a very sick patient, and in front of you, you see them warm up. Their results, their pulse goes from being thready to a bounding pulse. Children wake up. You think in front of your eyes that actually you've done the right thing. But in fact, actually, shock reversal at 1 hour did not protect you from dying. The excess death in Feast was not flooding the lungs or the brain, but it was actually children went back into lethal shock, often with a moment's notice that the excess mortality was cardiogenic deaths, and that doesn't mean fluid over, it was basically cardiovascular collapse. So again, we have learned a lot doing a clinical trial, and I think future therapies should also be subjected to a rigorous trial, we hope. Thank you, Liz. Was I on time?
Thank you, and very well done, yes. Again, are there 1 or 2 questions? There will be time to discuss more generally, because I think it's quite good to hear what everybody has to say, but is there anything that you'd like to ask Kath specifically now?
I think
yes, we have a question.
Tricky stairs. Yeah.
Thanks, Kath. Just very quickly, I was wondering if it's so obvious, and it seems to be, really obvious what you're showing us. What are the arguments of WHO not to accept those recommendations and to stick to the boluses?
I actually I reviewed their recommendations, and we gave them we've given them all of the data from the Feast trial, obviously in a policy document, so they've all of the data that you've been shown today, not the database, but obviously, and they've seen all of that information, and they ignored it, and also my review. So obviously with Trevor Duke's recent commentary in The Lancet, really there was some unfortunate misinterpretation of the Feast trial data, even although we pointed that out, to say that we assigned children unequally to the bolus and no bolus arms for the WHO shock, and so tried to downgrade the results, which was not correct. So I think the people advising them had a different agenda. I'm sorry to say, my agenda is saving lives. Their agenda was that we didn't like this trial, it's not convenient, and then recommended the upscaling to giving CPAP, to giving adrenaline and pressors, which there's no evidence that that is safe. I mean, that's the really important thing. We have to establish the safety of that next level before we recommend it. For Liz?
Perhaps I can just add one thing, which is that WHO was already reprinting its pocketbook. And it was recommended that they hold it back a little bit to see how all these things would fit. But I don't know, the WHO train seems to, once it starts, it doesn't stop. So I think it's, and I don't know how often they rewrite these things, not very often. So I think it's unfortunate that that was reprinted at the time it was. And I think and hope that in the next rewrite of that little blue book, which I think we all find very helpful, it'll be perhaps a little more influenced, shall I say, by the study.
By evidence.
Sorry, one more question, and then let's move on.
Do you think no children has to receive bolus, or are there profiles not to receive the bolus? And which are these profiles of children?
And I don't, what's profiles mean? Sorry, I don't. No.
Have you subpopulation not
No.
to receive,
None.
or anyone?
We've not found a subgroup yet, and we've been looking at this data for 5 years.
The subgroup who will need bolus is those who have a cardiac insufficiency, is that right?
No, don't give a fluid bolus. That's what the FEAST trial says. It's very, very consistent. Sorry. The thing that Liz said right, it's very difficult to stand in front of a patient and watch them. What do? You have to sit on your hands because you want to do something, and it is very difficult. But the nurses said that the patients who received maintenance or control, they were sicker for longer, but they took a little while to come up, but they did, and they obviously 3 per 100. You can't work out the benefit until you do the big trial.
Kath, thank you very much. I think there is no doubt that the FEAST trial has really created a debate. My suggestion is that there's another trial, because what you're talking about from the world literature is one trial. And this is very dangerous if you really go out on one trial. And the fact that you've got WHO in opposition at the moment, apparently, I think that wouldn't it be a good idea to repeat this, perhaps slightly different design, but still a randomized controlled trial, so you have 2 trials to look at instead of 1, because otherwise it just goes a bit too far, I think, to be too strong. That's just a personal view.
No, I think well, it's a multi-centre trial. Remember, it's not a single, so it's 6 little trials, but together. But I completely agree, because unless it is reproduced, but I think Kathryn Maitland shouldn't be there, because if I'm there doing the trial, nobody will believe it as it is. So I do think this is if somebody else would want to do it, I'd do another one.
What you've done is very important. You've
but
raised
could we do it
discussion.
in Africa? Is it ethical? I mean, that's
yes,
I
think it is ethical, definitely.
I think we could go
Yes,
on
I
and
think
on, so we're going to stop there.